Who was Paul Revere? Paul Revere was a clever boy. He was also a boy who liked having money in his pocket. At 15, he came up with a smart idea for a new business. Near his family's home in Boston, Massachusetts, was Old North Church. It was sometimes called 8 Bell Church because of its 8 huge brass bells. The smallest one weighed more than 600 pounds. The largest one weighed more than 1,500 pounds. Bell ringers pulled ropes on the bells to move them. Each bell made a different chime. Altogether, the ringing bells sounded beautiful. To this day, they are considered the best bells in Boston. The bells weren't just rung on Sunday mornings. If there was a fire, they were rung. When somebody died, the bells rang out the number of the person's age. The bells were rung for many reasons. Paul figured that the church might need extra bell ringers, and he was right. The church agreed to pay Paul and 6 friends 3 shillings a week for their services. Shillings were British coins made from silver. At the time, everyone in Massachusetts used British money. That's because the colony belonged to Great Britain. It was one of 13 British colonies in America. Paul wanted to make sure that all the bell ringers did their fair share of work. So he wrote up a contract. It described what the boys had to do as bell ringers. It said that every 3 months a different boy would hand out the money. New members could only join if everyone in the group voted them in. Paul also wrote that no member would ever beg for money. The members of the bell-ringing business worked for their money. Today, the contract is in the Museum of Old North Church. It is neatly written. Paul's handwriting is quite fancy. The contract says much about Paul Revere. He was a boy who believed in fairness. He didn't care about being the boss. The boys would take turns being in charge of the money. The group, not Paul alone, would make decisions. This was an important idea at that time, especially in Boston. Many people resented how powerful the King of England was. Why should one man control thousands of people living far away in the 13 colonies? Bell ringing was also just the right business for Paul Revere. In the 18th century, telephones, televisions, and computers were all far in the future. Bell ringing signaled big news. The people of Boston would flock to churches to find out what was going on. Paul liked being at the center of things, and throughout his life, that's where you could usually find him. By the 1770s, many Americans were ready to break away from England and start a brand new country. Paul Revere was one of them. He was not a leader of the American Revolution like George Washington or John Adams, but he spread the news about the Revolution. In some way, he was a bell ringer all his life. Chapter 1. Boston Boy. In the last week of 1734, Paul Revere was born in the town of Boston. He was the first boy in the family. His older sister, Deborah, was about 3 years older than Paul. His mother, who was also named Deborah, was from Boston. Her family had come to America about 100 years earlier. After Paul, Deborah had 7 more children, but 2 died when they were still babies. Paul's father was from France. His name was Apollos Revere. When he was only 13, he came to America all by himself. Apollos' family sent him, hoping he would have a better life than he could have in France. The ship landed in Boston, which became his new home. He arrived knowing barely a word of English, but soon Paul's father learned a trade. He became a silversmith, a really good one. In time, Paul's father opened his own shop. He made some very beautiful things. 2 small gold buttons with a beautiful flower pattern showed his skill and talent. Because so many people had trouble pronouncing his name, Paul's father decided to change it. So he wanted a name that sounded more American. So Apollos Revere became Paul Revere. The Reveres lived in a small house on Fish Street. It was close to the harbor. There were only about 13,000 people living in Boston when Paul was a child. No house was more than a few streets from water. Paul grew up watching ships arrive from England, bringing tea, furniture, and other goods for people in the colonies. Ships made the return trip to Europe, bringing things from America: timber, rice, cotton, and tobacco. Besides the big trading ships, hundreds of small boats went out every day fishing for cod, lobsters, and oysters. Paul was bright and full of energy. He had dark hair and brown eyes like his father. He loved swimming, riding horses, and playing with his friends. As a small boy, Paul went to a school where strict old women taught boys and girls the alphabet. Students used horn books, small wooden paddles covered with a clear sheet of animal horn. A lesson would be slipped under the horn so it wouldn't get dirty. Children who made mistakes in their lessons were bopped on the head with a stick. At age 7, Paul was sent to North Riding School. In Boston, there were 2 kinds of public schools. Both were just for boys. Grammar schools prepared students for colleges such as Harvard and Yale. After that, they would begin careers as lawyers, doctors, and ministers. Writing schools were for middle-class boys like Paul, who would become craftsmen. There he learned math and good penmanship. Paul's most important teacher was his father. He taught Paul to be a silversmith. The shop may have been in a separate little building next to their house. As an apprentice or beginner, Paul worked beside his father every day. At first, he could only do simple jobs. He swept the floor, making sure he brushed up all the silver dust so it could be reused. He put more coal in the furnace that melted down the silver. Learning how to work silver was difficult. It cracked easily. It took many years to become a master silversmith. The work was dangerous, too. Furnaces melted blocks of silver at temperatures reaching 2,000 degrees. The melted silver was poured into molds and left to harden. If an apprentice was not careful, he could end up badly burned. A flat, thin piece of silver was placed on a metal block called an anvil and hammered into simple things like spoons and knives. Early on, Paul learned to hammer out dents in bowls and plates. He learned to make silver thimbles. He repaired the hinges on tankards. Tankards were large mugs that came with hinged lids. Paul's training probably lasted about 7 years. The silver pieces made by the Reveres were simple but graceful. Sometimes a fancy tray or bowl might be decorated with silver shells or bunches of grapes. Sometimes they were engraved. That means a design was scratched into the surface of the silver. Paul became an expert at using a sharp engraving tool called a burin. The last step was to take a cloth and polish the piece of silver until its surface shone like a mirror. When Paul was only 19, his father died. Now Paul had to run the silver shop with help from his younger brother Tom. His brother John decided to become a tailor. After a year or so, however, Paul made a big change in his life. He wanted to leave Boston. Perhaps he had grown tired of the silver business. Perhaps he wanted to have an adventure. Paul left his brother in charge of the shop and went off to be a soldier. Chapter 2. Colonial Soldier. The 13 colonies that belonged to England stretched along the Atlantic coast as far south as Georgia. By the mid-1700s, there were about 2 million colonists living on what amounted to more than 322,000 square miles of land. The King of England, however, wanted more land. He had his eye on what is now part of Canada. He also wanted land in the Ohio River Valley and by the mouth of the Mississippi River. The problem was that the King of France already had settlements in these areas, and he was not about to give them up. So England and France went to war. The war became known as the French and Indian War, because many Native American tribes sided with France. It lasted a long time, from 1754 to 1763. Even though Paul was an American colonist, he was a British citizen. So when he became a soldier, he fought along with the British Army. Soldiers from England wore a uniform with a bright red jacket. That's why they were called redcoats. Colonial soldiers like Paul wore a uniform with a dark blue jacket. Paul was sent to a fort on the shore of Lake George in upstate New York. The French troops were nearby. All through the summer, Paul and the rest of the troops remained inside the fort. They were waiting for their enemy to strike, but the French were waiting too. They expected the British to fire the first shot. Finally, in November, Paul went home to Boston. The battle did eventually start, and the British won it. George Washington was another colonial soldier who fought for the British in the French and Indian War. He helped build around 80 forts. Unlike Paul Revere, he took part in battles. George Washington learned a lot about both winning and losing. The French and Indian War was a training ground for him. 13 years later, General George Washington led colonial troops to victory in the American Revolution. Chapter 3. Family Life. Paul returned to Boston in his life as a silversmith. He wanted a family of his own now, and it didn't take him long to find a good wife. In August of 1757, he married Sarah Orne. He called her Sari. Not much is known about her. The young couple lived in the house where Paul had grown up. His mother still lived there, too. In fact, she lived with her son and his family until she died. However, now she paid rent to Paul. This was a custom at the time. Paul and Sari's first child, a little girl named Deborah, was born in 1758. Every 2 years, Sari had another child. Paul called them his little lambs. By 1773, she'd given birth to 8 children, but 3 died young. In the late 1700s, babies and young children often didn't live long. There were no medicines to cure fevers. Sometimes outbreaks of a deadly disease called smallpox spread through Boston. Horrible sores broke out on a person's face and body. If smallpox didn't kill you, it left you scarred for life. As for Sari, she fell sick and died not long after her last baby was born. The baby, Isana, survived a little longer, then died too. It was a hard time for Paul. He had a large family, his mother was growing older, he needed a wife to care for the children. He met Rachel Walker, and in less than a year, they were married. Paul and Rachel were very happy together. She was clever, like Paul, and dark-haired, too. In a poem he wrote for her, he said that she was the fair one who was closest to my heart. They had 8 more children. 3 of Rachel's babies died young, too. Out of 16 children, 5 were still alive when Paul died in 1818. Paul worked hard. He made whatever a customer wanted. Once he made a silver chain for a pet squirrel. Another time, he made a silver whistle for a child. He made lovely coffee pots, teapots, sugar bowls, and creamers. Today, pieces of silver by Paul Revere are in the finest museums in the United States. Of course, he didn't only make fancy things for the rich people of Boston. In the 1760s, the city went through hard times. Shops were closing. A bank failed. Not nearly as many people could afford costly silver items. So what did Paul Revere do? He made buckles, eyeglass frames, and surgical tools. From iron, he made keys, hooks, and locks. He learned to make copper engravings. With a burin, he could engrave a portrait or a scene onto a copper plate. Once the plate was inked, the image could be printed on paper. Was Paul Revere an artist? No. In fact, he was not very good at drawing. His engravings were copies of artists' work. He even taught himself to make false teeth. This was a smart move. In colonial times, people suffered terribly from rotten teeth. One visitor from Sweden said that most young colonial girls he saw were missing half their teeth. Paul made false teeth from the tusks of hippos. He printed ads that said his false teeth looked good. They were also comfortable to wear and of real use in speaking and eating. He was hardworking and smart, but he also liked the company of friends. After work, he often headed to the nearest tavern. It was called the Green Dragon Tavern. A dragon hammered out of copper hung from a pole over the door. Taverns often had signs that explained their names. At the Green Dragon, Paul liked to play card games and backgammon. He enjoyed talking about politics with friends. He was a joiner. He became a member of quite a few men's groups. One held its meetings at the Green Dragon Tavern. Another met above a printing shop. The group was called the Long Room Club. Many men who became leaders of the American Revolution belonged to this club. A beer maker named Sam Adams was a member. So was John Hancock, who was one of the richest men in Boston. Most of the men had gone to Harvard, but they welcomed Paul. They admired his good sense and his energy. At meetings of the Long Room Club, there was a lot of angry talk about taxes. Colonists had no say in what taxes they had to pay. The government in England decided their taxes. Was this fair? Not in the minds of the Long Room Club members. It had to stop. Chapter 4. Taxes, taxes, and more taxes. The British won the French and Indian War. King George III now owned a lot more land in America. But the 9-Year War had cost a lot of money. Also, now the king had to send hundreds of British soldiers to America to keep control of the new land. It cost a lot of money to house and feed a big army. England was in debt, big time. The war had been fought in America, so why shouldn't colonists in America help pay for it through new taxes? At least that's what Parliament thought. Parliament was the elected government in England. Did Paul and the other men of the Long Room Club agree with this? No, they certainly did not. They were angry. American colonists didn't elect any members of Parliament, so colonists really had no say about passing new taxes. That wasn't fair. Every colony had its own government, but the local governments were not in charge of taxes. In 1765, the Stamp Act was passed in England. Newspapers, contracts, marriage certificates, decks of cards, as well as many other paper goods now had to have a British stamp on them. Colonists had to pay for the stamp. Oh, did that get Paul Revere angry? He joined a secret group led by Sam Adams. It was called the Sons of Liberty. Paul designed a medal for all the members. They marched through Boston shouting, "Liberty, no stamps." The march worked, or so it seemed. News arrived from England. The Stamp Act was over. In Boston, everyone celebrated. Fireworks burst in the night sky. Candles were lit in the windows of houses. A huge paper lantern stood in the center of town. Paul Revere may have designed the lantern himself. It turned out, however, that people celebrated too soon. 2 years later, in 1767, new taxes were announced on glass, paper, paint, and tea. This made Paul and the other Sons of Liberty even angrier. They asked all the people of Boston to stop buying things from England. Then they went to local government in Massachusetts. They convinced its members to send a letter to all other colonies. The letter stated that what England was doing was wrong. If the colonists gave in to these taxes, more taxes were sure to follow. All the colonies needed to band together and stand up against England. The king was furious when he found out about the letter, but 92 of the men in Boston who signed the letter stuck by it. In their honor, the Sons of Liberty had Paul make a big silver bowl. It is now in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Did protests stop just because the king was angry? No, they continued. British tax collectors arrived to collect the tax money. Paul and the other Sons of Liberty decided to rough them up. They waited until it was dark. Paul and his friends wore caps pulled low over their heads, and they blackened their faces. This way, the tax collectors couldn't identify their attackers. After the fight, the British sent 8 warships with cannons to Boston. They formed a semicircle around the harbor. It was a warning to the town that everyone had better behave. Paul made a copper engraving of the scene to spread the news of what happened. Again, he made a copy of someone else's drawing. Hundreds of people in Boston bought prints of it. British soldiers became an unwelcome part of life in town. They had orders not to start fights with the people of Boston, but tempers were hot on both sides. Fighting was bound to come. It was just a question of when. Chapter 5, Blood is Spilled. For a year and a half, Boston stayed calm. Then, on the snowy night of March 5th, 1770, everything changed. It is not completely clear what started the clash. According to one account, a British soldier didn't pay for repairs on a wig of his. A young shop boy chased after him, and a fight started between the two. Very quickly, a crowd of townspeople gathered to defend the young boy. British troops rushed to the aid of the soldier. The fighting grew more serious. Then, all of a sudden, shots rang out. British soldiers were firing into the crowd. They were shooting colonists. A moment later, 4 men lay dead in the snow. Another man died 4 hours later. Paul Revere made an engraving of the event which became known as the Boston Massacre. A massacre is the murder of innocent people. Was Paul himself there, taking part in the fight? Maybe. His engraving shows many details, including exactly where the soldiers stood and where the bodies fell. so perhaps Paul was in the crowd. In any case, thousands of copies of his engraving were sold. It was in color, and what caught people's eyes were the red coats of the soldiers and the red blood of the victims. Because of the massacre, many more people now agreed with Paul and the Sons of Liberty. It was time to break free from England. England saw that it had a huge problem on its hands. Parliament tried to calm down the colonists. The British soldiers were put on trial for their shootings, and the hated taxes were ended, all except for one. The tax on tea was left in place. It was a very small tax, but by this time even a small tax on something cheap was too much for the Sons of Liberty to stand. 3 ships arrived from England carrying chests full of tea. At the Green Dragon Tavern, Paul took part in a meeting of the Sons of Liberty. They decided to make sure that no one bought the tea, and if no one bought the tea, no taxes could be paid on it. They came up with a secret plan. They were going to hold a tea party, a very different kind of tea party. On the night of December 16th, 1773, Paul Revere and about 150 other men and boys sneaked aboard the 3 ships. They had smeared their faces with red paint and black soot. They wore blankets over their shoulders. They were trying to look like Indians. Paul Revere even gave himself an Indian name. He called himself Mohawk. His teenage son, Paul Jr., may also have been part of the gang. One by one, the chests were opened, and all the tea, 10,000 pounds, was dumped into Boston Harbor. When the tea party was over, the Sons of Liberty marched to the State House. There was music and cheering from the crowd on the docks. Then the Indians went home to their families. But Paul Revere still had another job to do. Paul was chosen to spread the news about the Boston Tea Party. He was an excellent choice for the job. Paul was strong and never needed much sleep. He also loved riding horses. In fact, he owned a horse even though he did not need one for his silversmith business. So off Paul Revere galloped to New York City and then to Philadelphia. In those days, it could take as long as 9 days for a letter from Boston to reach New York City. But Paul would rise at dawn and ride hard and fast all day. It was winter and the roads were bad. Yet Paul Revere returned to Boston only 11 days later, and he brought back good news. The Sons of Liberty in New York City and Philadelphia were thrilled about the Boston Tea Party. They would try to help the Patriots in Boston in every possible way. This was the first of many important rides for Paul Revere. He became a secret messenger for the cause of American liberty. Because of him, people in other colonies quickly learned about the important events taking place in Boston. The news that Paul delivered brought the colonies close together. More and more, they were becoming united against a common enemy, the King of England. Chapter 6, Creeping Up to War. So was Boston punished for its tea party? Oh yes. The king's warships closed the port of Boston until the tea was paid for. Cargo ships couldn't come in or go out. Trading stopped. Soon, many businesses shut down. More British troops arrived to patrol the streets. Town meetings were banned. Rebels were to be sent to England for trial. Who spread the word of all this terrible news to New York City and Philadelphia? Why, Paul Revere, of course. It was dangerous work. Now people couldn't leave Boston without a pass. British soldiers knew Paul belonged to the Sons of Liberty. He was not going to be given any passes. So he had to sneak out of town. Luck was usually on his side, and he managed to ride past British guards unnoticed. Paul Revere was not only a messenger, he also served as a spy for the Sons of Liberty. Years later he wrote, quote, "We held our meetings at the Green Dragon Tavern. We were so careful that our meetings should be kept secret, unquote. Paul's job was to find out what the British troops were up to. He wrote, quote, "In the winter, towards spring, we frequently took turns, 2 and 2, to watch the soldiers by patrolling the streets all night," unquote. He also kept a boat for snooping around Boston Harbor. Once, British soldiers found him rowing right by Castle Island, the base for the British troops. That time Paul was not so lucky. The soldiers arrested him, and he spent 3 nights in jail. Until 1774, each colony had looked out for its own interests. Now the colonies did their best to help the people of Boston. Rice came in from South Carolina. Flour came from Maryland. Pennsylvania sent money. Even more important, the First Continental Congress, a group with representatives from every colony, met in Philadelphia to discuss what to do about the problems with England. By mid-April, the Sons of Liberty were preparing for a battle. A large number of guns and gunpowder were stored in the nearby town of Concord. Sam Adams and John Hancock were about to travel to the Second Continental Congress. They were staying in Hancock's house in Lexington, a town only a few miles outside of Boston. By snooping around, Paul Revere learned that they were going to be arrested soon. Word had to get to Hancock and Adams about the danger they faced. On April 18th, Paul found out that the British were definitely up to something. 1,000 British soldiers set out from Boston by boat. They crossed the Charles River to Charlestown. From there, they proceeded on foot to Lexington and Concord. They were ready for battle. Hancock and Adams had to be warned. Paul Revere and a man named William Dawes were ready to sound the alarm to everyone in the countryside. Dawes set off on horseback. Paul was to take a different route. That way, if Dawes were caught and arrested, Paul still might be able to warn the people of Lexington and Concord. Paul's first stop was Boston's Old North Church, the same church where he'd been a bell ringer as a boy. Its tall steeple could be seen in Charlestown. A few days before, he'd set up a clever plan. If the British were starting out by boat, 2 lanterns would be hung in the church steeple. If they were marching by land the whole way, there'd only be 1 lantern. The people in Charlestown would then spread the news of the British route to the towns that were farther away. Troops had already been spotted setting out by ship from the harbor. Quickly, 2 lanterns were placed in the steeple. Then Paul raced home, where Rachel helped him into his boots and kissed him goodbye. He was in such a hurry that he forgot his spurs. According to stories Paul later told his grandchildren, the family dog also raced out of the house and followed Paul down to the waterfront. So Paul sent the dog back home with a note tied to its collar. The note asked Rachel to send his spurs, and that's exactly what the dog returned with. They were hanging around his neck. Down at the waterfront, 2 friends were waiting by a boat that Paul had kept hidden all winter. The men were going to help Paul row across the harbor to Charlestown. A huge British warship was nearby. It was important to make as little noise as possible. Paul had meant to bring cloth to tie around the oars, but he'd forgotten that too. So one of the men raced to his girlfriend's house. She offered one of her own petticoats, which the men tore up and wrapped around the oars. That did the trick. The little rowboat passed by the British ship in silence. On the other side of the river in Charlestown, Paul was led to a horse. It was a strong, fast mare named Brown Beauty. He jumped in the saddle and off he headed for Lexington. It was the most important ride of his life. Chapter 7. Oops. From Charlestown, Paul galloped off in the moonlight. He hadn't gotten far when he was spotted by 2 British soldiers on horseback. but Paul managed to fly by them on Brown Beauty. On the way to Lexington, he kept stopping at houses, shouting to each family that the British were coming. Just before midnight, he rode into Lexington and reached Hancock and Adams. Paul told them the grave news. 1,000 troops were coming for them, and then after that, they were going to Concord to find all of the hidden weapons. At this point, William Dawes met up with Paul Revere. After a little rest and a quick meal, they started out for Concord. About halfway there, Paul Revere's luck ran out. He was surrounded by 12 British officers. One told him, "If you attempt to run, we will blow your brains out." Dawes was luckier. He got away but did not make it as far as Concord. As for Paul, he had to dismount. A British soldier led Brown Beauty away. Paul never saw the horse again. Instead of arresting Paul, the soldiers rode off, leaving Paul alone in the road. They probably thought getting to Concord and fighting was more important than dealing with one prisoner. Paul returned on foot to Lexington, where he spent the night. He helped John Hancock and Sam Adams escape, but he never made it to Concord. So what about Paul's ride made it so important? Because of Paul Revere, the people of Lexington were prepared for the British troops. And indeed, the very next day, on April 19th, the American Revolution began. Nobody knows exactly who fired the first shot on Lexington Green. One British soldier was wounded and 8 Minutemen were left dead. Minutemen was the name for local colonial soldiers because they would be ready to fight at a moment's notice. The next day in Concord, however, 500 Minutemen managed to beat the British troops, who were forced to retreat to Boston. It was a victory for the colonists. Paul did not take part in these first battles of the Revolutionary War. Once a real army was raised, he was no longer needed as a messenger. He hoped to become an important officer in the Continental Army. That didn't happen. He fought with local forces in Massachusetts and took part in a sea battle in Castine, Maine. It ended in a terrible defeat for the Americans. Paul was in command of Boston soldiers on one of the ships. The British caught the ships by surprise in a rear attack. Some were destroyed. During the battle, Paul got separated from his troops. The ship was destroyed. Paul and his men ended up walking all the way back to Boston. At the time, Paul was accused of acting cowardly, but for many years later, his name was cleared. Paul Revere was so good at so many things, but his time as a soldier was a low point in his life. During the war, he made himself useful in other ways. He learned to make gunpowder. His powder mill kept American forces supplied with ammunition. The colonies now needed to print their own money. Who did the engravings for the new money? Paul Revere. The war ended in 1781, and a new country was born. Paul Revere was now a citizen of the United States of America. He was 48 years old. Business at the silver shop was good. In time, he let his sons take over. What did Paul do with the rest of his life? If you think he retired, you're very wrong. Chapter 8, United States Citizen. Paul had always been a sharp businessman. Now that the war was over, he saw that there were many interesting opportunities for Americans. For example, before the war, iron tools and machines had to be bought from England. The colonists couldn't make that themselves. This wasn't the case anymore. Paul decided to open a foundry, a shop that made things out of cast iron. Soon he was turning out hammers, anvils, stoves, and more. He had always loved church bells, and many of the ones in Boston were old and cracked. So Paul taught himself how to make and repair bells. He made hundreds of bells, some as big as the ones in Old North Church. Young boys liked to come and watch the work. Paul enjoyed the company, but he had to keep warning the boys about staying away from the hammers and fire. "Take care, boys," he'd say. "If that hammer should hit your head, you'd ring louder than these bells do." Many of the bells made at Paul Revere's foundry are still ringing in Boston churches. The United States was building ships for its brand new Navy. The foundry was turning out nails, spikes, rudders, and bolts for the Navy. Ships were mostly made of wood, but ship bottoms needed to be covered with a sheet of copper. Wood would rot too quickly. Before the war, all the copper sheeting had to come from England. Not anymore. So Paul learned all about how thin sheets of copper were made. Then he spent nearly all the money he had to build a copper mill. He was in his 60s by then, but still willing to take a gamble. Paul's copper sheeting was so good, it was not only used on ships. The copper skin on the dome of the Massachusetts State House and New York City's City Hall came from Paul's mill. The Revere Copper Company is still in business today. Although not rich, Paul and Rachel were well off. In 1800, they sold their house on North Square and moved into a bigger brick house in Boston that they'd bought. They also had a small house in Canton, a country town near the copper mill. Paul still enjoyed saddling up a horse and dashing off for a ride. After Rachel died in 1813, Paul spent most of his time in Canton with his growing family. He was an old man now, and while most men wore long trousers and hats with brims, Paul still favored three-cornered hats and knee breeches. He looked like someone from the past. By the time he died at 83 on May 10, 1818, he had more than 50 grandchildren. They had always enjoyed hearing about their grandpa's daring ride, but with each passing year, there were fewer people outside the Revere family who remembered it. Chapter 9, Fame at Last. 50 years after Paul Revere's death, the Revere Silver Company was still in business. But outside of his family, no one remembered Paul Revere. That all changed in 1861. Why did Paul Revere suddenly become famous? It was because of a poem. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow was the best-loved poet in America. He was known for writing about America's past. He wrote about the Pilgrims in a poem called The Courtship of Miles Standish. He wrote about Native Americans in Hiawatha. In 1861, he wrote Paul Revere's Ride. It turned Paul into a folk hero. The poem starts off with the lines, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere." Longfellow's poem described Paul's ride as a thrilling adventure. Paul barely escapes from the British soldiers, but he manages to reach Sam Adams and John Hancock. He warns them that their lives are in danger. Thanks to Paul, they remain safe. As far as the real ride of Paul Revere, Longfellow got many of the details wrong. He had read Paul's own account of the ride, so he knew what the facts were. Yet he decided to change some things anyway. Perhaps one reason was to make the ride more exciting for readers. For instance, in the poem, Paul is all alone the whole time. That wasn't so. Longfellow also left out certain things. For example, he never says that Paul was stopped by British soldiers. Longfellow wanted to depict Paul Revere as a brave man doing his best for the cause of freedom. His poem was about the beginning of the American Revolution. It came out at a time when the United States was about to go to war again. In April 1861, the Civil War started between the North and South. It was a war over slavery, which was still legal in the South. In Paul Revere's Ride, Longfellow was trying to make a point about the Civil War. He was saying that the North had to fight to end slavery. It was a war for freedom, just as the Revolutionary War had been. Paul Revere's Ride became so popular that for decades all school children read it. Some learned all the lines by heart. Today, many critics think it isn't a very good poem, but it touched American readers of the time. Paul Revere became a famous patriot. Music was composed about the midnight ride. Famous artists did paintings of Paul on his horse. Books were written about him. Towns were named after him, not only in New England, but also in Pennsylvania, Minnesota, and Missouri. His three-story house still stands. It is known as the Revere House. Lots of school groups and tourists visit it every year. In Boston's North End, the Revere House is the only building from colonial times that remains. Nearby is a large bronze statue of Paul Revere. He is on horseback and caught mid-gallop. His coattails are flying. He is bringing important news. News that will change the history of America.